Okay guys, so check this out. This is the app that we've been building over the last few episodes, and as you can see we can click on items in our list in the left there, but we have something new today, and we have some date fields that we put in, and we've got a nice date drop down here with the year and month. You can scroll through it and all kinds of neat things. We've got a time picker here as well. And that's what we're going to be adding because our tow app was very nicely done so far, but it didn't have any dates in it. And so that's what we're doing in this episode. We are going to add some dates to our tow operations database. I'm your host, Sean MacKenzie. Thank you for joining me once again on my channel on data engineering. In this episode, we go back to our WebForms playlist, and we're going to take a look at how to use our date fields. Now what we're going to do today is we're going to create some date fields in our Azure SQL database, and then we're going to use the date fields and the date sort of characteristics of the text box in order to get dates into our database. Let's get to it. Interested in more resources in this area? Make sure to check out my Patreon. The link is in the description. Okay guys, so today is all about the dates. We're going into our database first. That's your SQL Server Management Studio that we opened last time. And as you can see there, that's the name of our server and our login that we created on our server. And we did all that in our previous episode. Check the card above here if you want to go back to that episode. But we are going to go back into our database, and we're gonna make some changes. We're gonna add a few date fields. Now you can see the little blue disk or cylinder that's beside the server there. That means that that's an Azure database, and we are using Azure SQL. This is completely online, and we're gonna go ahead and make a few changes to our database here. Now, if you set your database to go to sleep in order to save costs, it might take a minute for it to pop up in the SQL Server browser here, the Object Explorer. But it will come up eventually, and you'll see that table that we created, the tow_jobs, on the left-hand side there. And if we do a right-click select top 1,000, you can see the top 1,000 rows. And we can also go to the design view through using the right click on the table there. And that's what we're going to do today. We're not going to do any scripting on the database. We are going to use the graphical user interface, which is nice and easy for people to use. And we're going to add a few fields into our database here. And these are all going to be date time fields. And I think I'll put in a few, and we'll only work on a couple, but you can work on the other ones in your project if you want to add those and for practice. But we'll add a few fields here. So we're going to add a called in. So that's going to be the date time for when the call in was made to the tow office. And then we're going to have a dispatch time, and we'll have a operator arrival time. And you'll notice that I'm choosing the date time data type here. There are some other data types that I showed you in the drop down there, but for most intents and purposes, using the date time data type is more than enough for what people need. So those are our 4 fields that we're adding to our tow jobs table in our tow operations database, and we can just do a Control S there, or you can click the save icon in the toolbar, and then you can just close that design screen. It looks very similar to what you might see in Microsoft Access as well, but we can see our changes on the left side here in the Explorer. If you don't see your fields, you can right click on the tables above there, the tables folder, and you can do a refresh, and that will bring in any object changes. So that's a big thing to remember when you guys are using SQL Server Management Studio, is that oftentimes you need to refresh it. The refresh might not be automatic. Okay, so here I did right click select top 1,000, and you can see those fields have nulls in them. and you can see the little red marker there saying, hey, I don't know what this is, I don't know what these fields are, and you can do Control-Shift-R for a refresh of all of the data in the IDE here. So you can see the metadata, I should say, and you can see that that gets updated when I do that Control-Shift-R, and that is handy. So I'm just going to back right out of the server and disconnect. So we now have our new fields in our database, and we are going to open our project in Visual Studio, and we've started this a few episodes ago. If you haven't seen the earlier ones, go ahead and check those out, or if you're just interested in dates, you can stay here and watch this. We have one default page that we are using to do all of our stuff right now. The other pages were auto-generated. Those are the ones with the .aspx on the end. Each of those is a content page in our site here, and you can see this is the design view, the visual view, and you can click on that in the bottom left there if you want to see the visual view. And you can also look at the source view, which is very handy for a lot of people. So there's many ways you can look at the design and make sure you use the way that works best for you. So now I can click the continue or play button up on top there, or I can hit F5 on the keyboard, and it will bring up this database, and you can immediately see, or it'll bring up our application, I should say, and you will immediately see that the formatting's kind of screwed up because we added 4 fields into our system, and they extend that table over, and now you can see it's all kind of jumbled up, but the functionality you can see is still working. And that's what we want to see. And what we notice at this point in the game is we really don't need to have all of these fields showing in the list, because if the user can click on a row and then get all the detail for that record in the detail, then they really only need to see the things in the row that make sense to them to look at in sort of a tabular view. And so we're going to close that, and that will turn off the IIS Express there and shut down and allow us to do some code changes. So I opened the default page in the source view here, and then I hit F7. F7 opens up the code view, and you can also go to view and then view code. And what that does is this opens the code behind, as we call it, for the default page. So there's 2 parts to the default page. First part is the ASPX, that's all the blue text that's on the other page that you saw, and then this is the Visual Basic. And so what we're looking at here is we can see in our refresh list here, this was a function that we created, or a subroutine we created, to just refresh that list on that front page there, the very first page. And now instead of selecting star, which star gets all of the fields, it gets everything, we're gonna pick and choose some fields here that we want to see in our list. Now we need the tow ID because that is used as the ID field in the GridView object. So that's the table that we see in HTML there. And we're going to get the vehicle and the tow address. And you can see how I can make this easier to read for coding by closing my double quotes and then putting an ampersand and hitting enter to go to the next line. And so that's going to allow me to create the nice long SQL string if I need to, without needing to make spaghetti going off the end of the screen or off the side of the screen. And so we'll select our tow ID, our vehicle, our tow address, maybe a contact phone, called in, completed. So those are 2 of the dates that we're going to work on today. We'll work on the called in date and the completed date. And if you guys want to sort of activate the other two fields that we added into the SQL table, I challenge you to do so in your system that you're creating and tell me how that goes. So we're going to do those two dates, the called in date and the completed date, and then we'll say from tow jobs. And we're going to change the ordering this time. We're not going to just order it by the person who called it in. We're going to order it by the date of the called in date, basically. So we'll order it by the called in date. If you want, you can order that descending, which might actually make more sense. But for today, we have a very short list, so I'm just going to order by called in. Then we're going to open our SQL Server Management Studio that we had open before, and we'll just right-click on our table, and we'll go Edit Top 200 Records, and then we're going to plunk in a date into that called in, and we're going to do that just so that we have something to test before we have anything that updates the table, through our application. We want to have a value in there so we can actually see what's going on. And so I updated that in our table, so we've got a date in one of the called in rows there, and I'll hit F5 and start our application again, and that's going to have one date there, that 2023-04-24, and that's 5:35 p.m. You can see I can click on all of these rows here, and that one date has a value in it, so we should see once we put in our controls for the date, we should see that date populate in there, and that's what we're going to go do next here. To do that, we are going to switch to the default.aspx. Now I had that tab open on the top left there. You can double click on it in the list on the right if you didn't find it. And I switched to the design view, which I did. That's the little purple box in the bottom left there. You can see around the word design. So if I click on design, that's what I'm going to get here. And you can see this is where a lot of the sort of text that you see on screen can be changed. And you can see that there's paragraph markers. If you know anything about HTML, you don't need to know it, but it helps a lot. And you can see all I did was I put my cursor behind the text box there under contact phone, and then I hit enter, and that gave me a new row in my section here that I'm working on. And so I'm going to create a new field called in, and I'm going to go to my toolbox on the top left there. Now if you don't see the toolbox, you can go to the view menu and you can get the toolbox to show. And I'm just going to double click on the toolbox there, and you can see it put it in right where I had my cursor. And so that's what I've got there. So now I've got this text box. I kind of sized it to the same size as the other ones using the visual editor there. And now I can go to the properties, which is down in the bottom right here. Now the first thing that we want to look for is we want to rename this text box to something that makes sense for our application. And so in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to find that ID, and we'll do txt called in. We'll give that the name txt called in, and you can see that the name changes on the visual editor there. And then the next thing we're going to look for is the text mode, and the text mode we're going to switch to the date text mode. And what that does for us in any new browser, which is in the last 5 years probably, so almost every browser has this, you're going to get the nice date control that will show for that control. And if I put another text box in just below that, so I put my cursor behind the first text box and I hit enter, and it gave me a new row there, and then I double clicked on a new text box in the toolbox to get that one to show. And then I'll do the same thing. I'm going to call this one txt called in time, and that's going to allow us to have a date and a time field. And for this one, we're going to go to text mode, and we're going to call it, or we're going to use the time setting. So now we're going to have a time setting and a date setting, which makes it nice and easy for users. They can just click on it and hunt around for their date, and then click on the date they want. And then they can scroll through the times to choose a time that they want, and they can do that. Now I'm going to change this one to called in date, so that we have txt called in date and txt called in time for the two text boxes. You can see there's the date and there's the time. So now we've got two text boxes. Now these will show differently in the browser. I'll hit save there, and I'll hit F5 just to show you. So now I hit F5, and it's going to pull up our new screen. Now these won't be wired up yet, but you'll be able to see some of the control sort of features. So here we go. This is our little date selector. I'll scroll down a bit more. There we go. So you can see there's lots of features here. They can scroll around in the years and find the month that they want, and they can choose different dates. They can click on today, and it'll just put in today's date. And it gives a very nice presentation of dates, and we get the same thing happening for our time selector. We get this nice little time selector that is sort of standard across browsers. I will show this in Google Chrome as well. I'm using Edge right now, and we will show this in Google Chrome, which is very, very similar. And so between those two text boxes with the settings that we chose, we can choose a very solid date and time. And that is exactly what we want for our application. And so I close the browser there, and we can continue on and work on the rest of the application that we started in our previous episode. The next thing we're going to look at is how to show that called in date on our form when it pops up. And in order to do that, we are going to use our selected index changed event here, which is when somebody selects something in the list, then it fires off this bit of code here. And we did this last time, and it worked famously. And basically it just updated all of those text boxes on the right hand side of the screen, if you remember. And we're going to do exactly the same thing with our dates. And so we will essentially just put in our txt called in date.text is equal to, and we're going to concatenate with an empty string just in case there's a null in there, and we'll put in the date, but we're going to put it in formatted. So in today's case, what we'll do is we'll put it in a format that is unambiguous. So we're going to say format the row that came back in our selection, and we're going to put in the formatting, which is year, month, and date. Note the uppercase month characters. If you put lowercase, it will put in the minute, which won't make any sense, and then the control will get screwed up. And then for the time, we'll do the same thing. We're going to set the text of the time control equal to the formatting of the date time, but we're going to take the uppercase hours, which will give us the 24-hour clock, and then lowercase m's for minutes. And that sets us up nicely for looking at our date time. So what we can do now is we can just hit F5, and let's go and select that date that we put in, ahead of time. We put it into the SQL editor there, just so that we would have an entry in our called in date, and we'll select that row, and let's just see if it gets it right. It looks like it got it just perfectly. That's exactly what we want to see there. It got the 4:24 with 5:35 p.m. in the time, and very happy with that. That's exactly what we want to see there. And if we select one of the other rows, we can see, oh, it looks like it's holding those values, so we want to go and fix that next. But if we choose the row that has an entry in it, we are getting the right result, and that's what we want to see. Next, let's go and take a look at how to fix that selection issue where, if we pick one that is actually empty, we want the date field to clear out. So what we're going to do is we're going to say if the field has an entry in it, so the length is greater than 0, then we'll put in the date. Otherwise, we're going to put in an empty string, and that should clear the text box with the date control in it. And so we'll just move those 2 rows up that we did, setting the .text equal to the value with the formatting, and we're going to put that into the if there's an entry there, else set the text for each of those text boxes to an empty string, and we'll check how successful that was as we work on some other stuff. We'll go ahead and start on our updating procedure, and that's what we built last time, and we're going to add our dates to it. So the first thing that we're going to do is you can see this is our update string in SQL, and we've got our parameters here because we are building fully parameterized statements, which are the safest way to handle data that's coming from end users. Now we want to make sure that we do not use dynamic SQL here. We're going to use parameters for all of our updates and things like that, and all of our selects where there's any filters or anything like that. And just like we did for our other fields, we are going to update the called in field, and we're going to have a parameter called @calledIn. And so we added that to our static SQL string, and in order to update the actual field, we're going to do exactly what we did with our other fields, just like you see here, using a parameter and the same steps that we used before. So we're going to create a new parameter, and then we're going to assign a value to the parameter, and then we're going to add the parameter to the parameters collection of the command object there. And so we can do that very nice and easily, just the same way as we did the other ones. We'll say our called in parameter, PRM called in, as new SQL client.SQL parameter, and then we'll give it the same name as we used in the SQL string up above. So we'll do that. We'll say that the name is @calledIn, and it's going to be a parameter of the type datetime, the SQL DB type datetime. And so that makes a very nice, solid, tight sort of arrangement for our parameter with very little wiggle room, and so it makes it very, very nice and safe and secure, and we can continue on and assign the value to that. So what we can do to assign the value, we will just do PRM calledIn.value is equal to the txt calledIn. And now we're going to actually concatenate 2 values here to make an entry into the database. So we're going to take the called in date, and then we're going to concatenate with a space, and then the time that's in the time control. We'll put those together for the value, and then we'll add that parameter to the parameters collection. Now stay tuned to the end. I'm going to show you how to handle nulls on this, and we'll come back to that. But for now, this is going to work for our date field, So we're taking two control values, the date and time, putting them together, and we're going to load one field with that, a date time field. Let's go test that out. I've hit the F5 key on the keyboard, which will start the application. You can see it running on localhost there because we have not published it yet, so we're working locally, and that's going to bring up our database table here. So you can see we've got our list just like we had before, and if I click on certain entries in the list, you can see this one doesn't have an entry for the called in date, but if I go and I choose a date, I'll choose the 23rd, and I choose a time, some random time here, and then hit update. You'll see that the field got updated in the database because that did a round trip and it came back. Now we still have an entry left in our fields there, but if I click on other entries, you can see that they are flowing through nicely. So we've got, the right fields coming into the database. If I click on an empty one, you can see that the fields clear out. So the called in date and the called in time both get cleared, which is what we want to see. So that's great. And so we can go ahead and assign values to the other rows as well. So I'll select some random dates and times here. I'll choose 1 p.m. exactly for the called in date, and I'll hit update for that one, and you can see that got it in the list right there. And that's exactly what we wanted to see there. So we're storing the date and time into our date time field, and you can see that it's done the conversion nicely. It is displaying the date in my regional format. You might notice that in the list there. When we switch and use other regional formats, you'll see that the entries get changed, and so you might want to add formatting to that date that's coming out. I'm just my code here just basically plops it in there, whatever the database returns, and so we'll see how that works when we publish it out to the web. It might change the regional setting, and so if you wanted, you could change the formatting, but for now we'll leave that. So this is the section where we basically clear out the entries, and that's why we still could see entries in the date and time fields. We didn't actually clear them out yet, and so here we are, we're in the CMD update click event, so you can see that at the top of the IDE there. And we're going to add a couple of rows here, and we're going to set txt called in date dot text equal to an empty string, and we'll do the same thing for the time, and that's going to essentially clear it out after we click update. We don't really want to leave the old values in there. We want the list to update to show that the list, the entry was made and the list was updated, but we don't want to leave a bunch of data in the field. So now you can see if we click on our fields here, there's a date in the date and time fields there, and if I click one that is empty for the called in, I can go ahead and select from our drop down calendar selector here, and I can choose some date. I'll choose, maybe they want to schedule tow pickup for tomorrow or something like that, or it was something, I don't know, or they called it in, it's a future call in, I don't know. But notice that was actually the Camry that we updated, and it was for the 25th, and the selected item is actually not the right one anymore, and we're going to go fix that because the sorting of the table has occurred, and so the selected index stayed the same, which means the second row, which was the one that we chose, but actually we wanted that Camry there, and so we're going to fix that sorting, not the sorting, but the selected item in the list, In case the list gets resorted, we want the selection that we had before. We're going to come back and fix that. So I'll show you guys how to do that. But for now, let's go ahead and put in entries for the other ones here. We'll choose a PM there. This one was apparently out of gas, and the gas can was nearby. And I can go ahead and click update on that, and we should see now we have dates for all of our entries, and you can see that there's the entry for the 23rd. And so we can click each of these in succession, and it will select the right one for each of the ones we click. But when we hit update and the list gets resorted, the selected indexes might not be the right one for the one we just updated, but we want to show the one we just updated, so we will come back to that. So I can go and I can do an update. I can change the values in there as well after I've selected each one, so that makes it nice and easy. We can go and look between all of these, and that's just great. So I'll close the browser there. That's what we wanted to see. And now what we want to do is we're just going to take a look here and see in our CMD update click. So this is the update button, and we're going to look at the order of what's happening here. And so what we want to do is we want to capture the value or the selected ID value. So we kept that column in the grid view. So we'll grab that tow ID and we'll make a new variable for that, because the refresh list that you see just below what I'm typing there, that's gonna resort everything, and then the selected index may not be the right one. So we want to make sure that we capture the tow ID before it gets sorted, so that we can set it to the right one after it is sorted. So one way to do that is to just loop through the grid view and look for your ID that you selected, which we put into int tow ID there, and we can loop through and just check and see, if the value in the tow ID column is equal to the ID, then we'll set the selected index to that row. And so I'm having lots of trouble here. So there we go. We can do if the cells, the first cell, not the zero cell. The zero cell is actually the select indicator that you saw there, because this is a grid view, not a data table. So we'll say if cells 1.text is equal to our tow ID, then we'll set the grid view main selected index equal to the grid view row index, and that'll set it to the right one. And that's sort of a quick and dirty way of doing it. You can also select inside of it as well and get the grid view row and all that stuff. And I'll put an exit 4 on there in case it goes halfway down the list and then it finds it. It won't traverse the rest of the list. It'll just set it and then exit, and then we can hit F5. And now what I can do is, we can select a row here, and you can see each of these selects just fine, and you can see the values in the called in here, and we can hit update, and now you can see that that list item moved up in the list, but it retained the correct selection for the list. And so that's what we want to see there. So that's another thing you got to watch out for, is just getting that list selection correct. And after you do your update, because your update might actually change the item's position in the list depending on how the list is sorted. That worked great for the called in field, and now we're going to look at our completed date and time field. And in the interest of time, I have prepared that already and skipped ahead so that you can see what I've done here. just like we did for the called in date and time. I've done the same block for the completed date and time, and I did the same changes in our SQL string. You can see that here as well, using the parameterized query, and also I have added the parameter and the loading of the value of the parameter, just like we did for our called in. I did that here. So there's our called in parameter that we created, loaded the value, and then added it to the collection. I did the same thing with our completed date, and then at the very end of our procedure after the update, just like our called in where we clear out the called in fields, we are also going to clear out the completed date fields. I'll hit F5, and there we go. We're starting up our application, and we should be able to see our completed dates now. So there we go. We've got our called in dates, and now we can add the tow completion date and time to our application. So there we go. There's the field, newly added, newly minted. So we'll say it was completed on the 25th, and we'll choose 2:22 p.m. and then we can hit update and go see if that actually worked. There we go. We've got our tow completion in there for 2:22. It was recorded 2 days earlier at 10:56, so we're not having very good return time on that, but we'll choose the 21st for the next one. So we can choose the 21st. I can scroll that down so you can see here. There we go. We'll choose the 21st for completed, and we'll choose some random time here, 4:24 p.m. So it was a 5-hour turnaround. We'll hit update, and there you have it. We've got some completed times in there with our selected times. We can scroll through our list here, and now we've got a bit more of a functioning database application on app services, and that adds dates to the mix. One neat thing that you can do is you can start your application, and generally it will start with Edge, and Edge is a nice browser, and you can copy the address that you have in Edge and copy it over to Google Chrome or some other browser that you might have, and so I'll just paste that in there. There is my Google Chrome, and you can see that the page looks a little bit different, slightly different, because the controls and how the browser handles those the drop downs and things is a little bit different, but you can see it's almost the same between the two, which is really nice to see. So there we go. We've got our date time happening in Chrome and in Edge, and that's something you should definitely test out if you expect users are going to use all kinds of browsers, or you might need to notify users that they have to use an HTML5 capable browser. And one of the things, there's a big gotcha, so make sure that you pay attention here. One of the things we look for is the case where there's no date in the value, and that can actually stop your update from happening. So you can see that the double quote space double quote that's used in the concatenation is the only thing that's left if both of the other values are blank. And so we want to make sure that we put in if the length is equal to 1, which is those the double quote space double quote, then we're going to put a null value in instead of trying to put in a single space, because a single space is not a date, and that may cause your application to get an error. And so I highly recommend you put the nulls in there instead, you can use the db null.value, and that's gonna save you if you notice that some updates are not happening, or if you have nullable fields. For example, if you allow nulls into your date fields, you may notice some issues. So let's go test that out. Now you'll notice that I'm actually publishing it to Azure this time. I am not starting it on my local host. I decided to publish it instead to Azure App Services. You can see the nice URL at the top of the screen there, toe-operations.azurewebsites.net. So this is going to be a full deployment. We're just publishing out and waiting for it to start. Now sometimes it takes a minute to start after you just publish it. You'll be requested for your Microsoft sign-in, whatever that might be, or whoever it is that you allowed into your application using some kind of Microsoft login, which is a great way to do it. In this case, I have my multi-factor authentication enabled there, and so you saw that. You will get the same depending on what your security is and how you've set it up. But there we go. We have our application. I've added some more rows of data to our application so that you can see a little bit more of a detailed view here. Some of them are the same as the original list, and I've added some to it as well. So I can go in, I can change some entries, and I can select different dates. I can use our nice little date selector here. I can scroll through the months and choose different months if I want, if there are dates that need to be changed, or perhaps there is some historical data that has to be entered. Note the formatting change, so you can change the formatting in the list as well, but that is how you can use dates in your WebForms application. If you haven't yet, make sure to go to my community tab and vote on any polls that are there.